Magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworldeldar.com. I'm Brent, and in this video I'm going to be talking about scoring secondary objectives as an Aeldari player in the 10th edition Warhammer 40,000 tabletop game. Before I do, if you have not liked the video and subscribed to my channel, that would be awesome. Also, comments help my algorithm. Okay. So if you're new to Warhammer 40,000 or you're just new to 10th edition, you may not know how scoring works. There are 100 possible victory points that a player can score in the course of a game. 10 of those are awarded just for having a painted army. 50 of those are scored with reference to something called primary objectives, and then 40 can be scored for secondaries. Here's the oversimplification. Primaries are all about holding objectives on the table, so having your models in certain places on the table and keeping them alive while they do so. And secondary objectives are all about doing stuff. Sometimes it's about being places, sometimes it's about killing particular types of units, sometimes it's about not shooting and because your unit is performing some action, but it's all abstracted and it's just like, so sometimes it's about deciding not to do things with certain units. But primary objectives are about holding points on the table, and secondary objectives are about stuff your units do. So you need to be able to do both of these things to win a game of Warhammer, and ideally also prevent your opponent from doing both of these things. Now, although this video, as I've said, is focused on scoring secondary objectives, I am also going to talk a little bit just at the beginning about primary objectives. There are more choices to make with secondaries. So I think it's more deserving of a, well, it's not more deserving of a video, it's just the video I'm making today. I think that it's the reason that I'm inclined to make this one before I make one about primary objective scoring is that secondary objective scoring has changed a lot more in this edition than primary scoring has. Primary scoring is more dynamic than it's ever been. It's highly variable, but if you were good at scoring primary objectives in previous editions of 40K, you probably still know how to do it, but secondaries might be throwing you for a loop. So that's what we're focusing on. So here's what this looks like in 10th edition 40K. There is a deck of cards. This deck of cards is a Leviathan deck. It comes in the base set for 10th edition that was released when 10th edition landed, and you can also buy the deck separately. And technically, when you play a game using this deck of cards, you are playing a Leviathan game, a Leviathan chapter approved battle. Nobody calls it that ever. Nobody calls it that ever. But if you're using the Leviathan deck, when you set up a game, you start by pulling a card for the layout of the board, so the deployment zones, and it's all the deployment zones that have existed in previous editions, where you're going short across the board the long way, or it's, you know what they are. It's diagonal deployment, or at one end of the rectangle or the other, and there's some other weird stuff. They all have names that will not be helpful to new players for me to drop, but the deployment zones are all what they've always been, and then there's some sort of special rule that's in place, like, you know, Vox static, your command rerolls costs an extra CP. There's some little twist. If you roll a 6 to advance, you take a mortal wound because there's a landmine. It's like fun flavor stuff for the most part. Something like the command reroll 2 CP rule can really matter, but for the most part, those flavor rules keep you on your toes, but they, except for ones that prevent certain sorts of tricky deployment, they don't really impact the game in a way that's likely to change outcomes. But then you also draw into some sort of primary mission that tells you how exactly the objective markers that are specified by the cards with the deployment zones need to be altered or moved, and then how you go about scoring points for sitting on them. And this is not a video about primary objective scoring, but I will just say this. The way 10th edition Craft World Eldar work is that they're an army that relies on killing the opponent pretty fast before they can kill you, and then scoring big, especially in the later half of the game, But a lot of Eldar scoring really does rely on dealing damage. And if you're new to 40k, that might not seem very insightful. You might be like, well, surely that's what every army does. It's a war game, for goodness sakes. But that isn't what every army does. Tyranids, for example, rely on flooding the board with bodies, basically getting wiped out, but winning on points. The way Imperial Guard works in this edition is it's all about like locking down your half of the field, messing up your opponent with indirect fire, and just sending wave after wave of disposable infantry into the midfield to grab objectives and die. That's not, neither of those things is how Eldar play, right? So every army plays a bit differently. Eldar want to keep their heads down and do devastating damage with their advanced wacky Xeno technology, and generally win by devastating your opponent, so they just don't have enough tools left to play the primary or secondary objective game. They're also, just in case you've been, I don't know, living under a discarded helmet, they're also at the top of the meta right now. Eldar are one of the most competitive armies in the game, but as a new player, you still need to think tactically about how you're going to score. This, at the end of the day, this is a game in which we score points, and so anytime you build an army from any faction with an eye towards trying to win games, not just with an eye towards telling a fun story, you need to think about scoring. And so we're going to be talking in this video about what that looks like, specifically with regard to the secondary missions. For the primary missions as an Eldar player, you need to have units that kill stuff. You need to have at least some durable units in your army, at least one or two, and then you need some units that are highly mobile. And conveniently, those are the same types of units you're going to need for secondary objectives. And it is for that reason, I think, that in all of the Eldari lists that have made it onto the podium, top 3 at grand tournaments so far in 10th edition, have leaned into the same. There's variability in the lists for sure, but there are also several units that reoccur in pretty much all of them. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what those units are, why they are so useful for scoring. And probably after this video, I'll do one on our best units and how to use them, in which I dig down further on the units that really do seem to be the foundation of competitive lists, at least in tournament play. Okay, but secondary missions, the reason that we're here. So, as I said, you can score up to 40 points for secondary missions, and at the beginning of each match you play, you can choose to either play fixed secondary missions, or you can play tactical secondary missions. Now, fixed secondary missions works a bit like previous editions. There are 16 possible secondary mission cards. Of these 16, 7 of these are fixed missions. And what that means is you could theoretically choose 2 of these that you have for the whole game, that are the only 2 secondaries you ever have, and score points for them every turn. The fixed secondaries are Storm Hostile Objective, which rewards you for taking an objective off of an opponent, or if your opponent doesn't control any, just for taking them. Cleansing Objectives, which is moving on to objectives and then performing an action, which means you don't shoot. Assassination, you get rewarded for killing your opponent's characters. Bring It Down, you get rewarded for killing your opponent's big monsters and vehicles. Deploy Teleport Homer, you get rewarded for performing actions near or in either near the center of the board or in your opponent's deployment zone. Engage on all fronts, you get rewarded for having units spread out all over the board, and behind enemy lines, you get rewarded for having units in your opponent's deployment zone. Now, I'm going to start by saying, and then so you either choose 2 of these, and those are with you for the whole game, and you can score them every turn, or you go for tactical objectives. Now, tactical objectives is cool. You shuffle that whole deck of 16 objective cards, and at the beginning of every turn, you draw 2 of these things. Now, you're stuck with them either until you score them successfully, or once per turn you can discard one of these for a command point. You get some reward for not being able to do the thing, and so you never know from turn to turn exactly what secondaries you're going to be trying to achieve. It requires a lot of flexibility in a list. You have to know ahead of time what kinds of things you might be asked to achieve and build your list with reference to those ideas. And it may sound, from what I have just told you, like obviously the more competitive pick is going to be to do fixed objectives. And it, in most cases, is not. So GW has done a really good job, in my opinion, of creating tactical objectives that they're broad enough that most of these are going to be possible against most armies. And the way they've set up the victory points, you can afford in the course of a game to throw away a tactical objective, just say, okay, this one I'm not going to be able to score, and still max out your score, because many of these are actually worth more victory points if you do them as tactical objectives than if you do them as fixed objectives. So, for example, for Behind Enemy Lines gives you 1 victory point if at the end of the turn you have a unit from your army in your opponent's deployment zone, wholly, and 4 victory points if you have 2 units, but you get +1 if you're doing it as a tactical objective. Now, 1 victory point isn't a big deal in a game, but over the course of a game, if that's true for every time you're achieving a secondary mission, you're getting an extra victory point, or maybe even more for doing it as a tactical objective. Over the course of the game, that's like potentially another 9 or 10 victory points, which is significant in helping you max out your secondaries. On the other hand, if you choose fixed objectives, the way that they're pointed, you pretty much have to achieve the objective, both of your fixed objectives, all 5 turns of the game to max them out. And that's really, really hard to do. So something like Behind Enemy Lines, because if you have 2 fixed objectives over the course of the game, you'd have to score 20 points each to get to 40. Well, Behind Enemy Lines, if you're not doing it as a tactical objective, gives you 4 points for having 2 units in your opponent's deployment zone. So you would have to have 2 units at the end of your turn in your opponent's deployment zone every single turn of the game. Now, there might be matchups in which you see that will be possible with certain deployments and certain builds, but in general, that's not going to be a thing that you can reliably do. I think that probably the most likely fixed objective option is Bring It Down and Assassination, the killing big stuff and killing characters. If you were to come up against a list that had a ton of, say, Tyranid monsters that all had the HQ designation, and you knew that to win the game, you had to kill them all or most of them, and that B, you could, then yes, it would absolutely make sense to take Bring It Down and Assassination, and once in a blue moon you might find yourself doing that. But for the most part, you are better off, and tournament data bears this out. Most people choose tactical objectives, and most of the people who are scoring and winning games are choosing tactical objectives, and generally people are scoring much better than with the fixed objectives. And I've got to say, I really like this change to the game. Back in 8th edition and in 9th edition, there were only fixed objectives, and you pretty much had to have a plan for how you were going to max them out every turn of the game. And yes, no plan survives first contact with the enemy, and so there was a lot of innovating and clever thinking that went into it. But it is true that before the game started, you were sort of creating an algorithm for victory and then trying to adhere to it. And what's so cool about these tactical objectives, these tactical secondaries, is that you have to have a flexible army that can do a lot of kinds of thing, and you know what sorts of thing you're going to be asked to do over the course of the game, and then you have to do it as you are called upon to do the thing. And that is super cool. I think it's a much more fun way to play 40K, and it is also conveniently the more competitive way to play 40K. So we're going to go through the 16 secondaries and talk about how to think about these as an Eldar player and what sorts of units you're going to need in your army to pull them off. I've already mentioned Behind Enemy Lines, so why don't we start with that one? So Behind Enemy Lines, I've said what it is. At the end of your turn, you need to have a non-aircraft unit or 2 units in your opponent's deployment zone. If you're doing this as a tactical objective and you can get 2 back there, you get 5 victory points. What does this mean? Well, it means you need stuff that's fast or stuff that's tricky. Many players are achieving this with warp spiders. Warp spiders are they're the fastest unit in our army. They can make a 24-inch move with their special rules, and So theoretically, you can move your warp spiders 24 inches. You could theoretically also then, even if it doesn't get you as far as you need to go, use Fire and Fade. So Fire and Fade costs 2 CP, but it allows you to shoot and then make a move, and that could be what it takes to get you the rest of the way into your deployment zone. Fire and Fade kind of does for us what Quicken used to do, and if you're just using the movement shenanigans of Fire and Fade to like avoid enemy retaliation, it's generally better to just use Phantasm instead. So Fire and Fade is a stratagem that costs 2 CP that lets you move after you shoot. Phantasm is a stratagem that costs 1 CP that lets you move after your opponent's movement phase. Now, 1 CP is obviously cheaper than 2 CP. The reason to use Fire and Fade generally is so that you can get somewhere on your turn to score secondaries at the end of your turn. The other advantage to Fire and Fade is that it lets you make a normal move equal to your move characteristic, whereas Phantasm is 7 inches. It's 2 CP in a game with limited CP, of course, but it's a really powerful scoring tool. Other units that can help you do this, on turn 1, Warwalkers are cheap. So Warwalkers make a scout move, and then so they move 9 inches before the game starts, and then on your turn they move 10 inches, and you could advance them for another d6. And then if you really needed to, well, I guess if you're advancing them, you wouldn't be able to Fire and Fade because you couldn't shoot, but you could make the 10-inch move, and then you could Fire and Fade for another 10 inches. So on your first turn, a Warwalker could go 29 inches, potentially, which could be what you need to score behind enemy lines. If you get behind enemy lines as a tactical mission, is generally hardest to score on turn 1. You may also be able to use something like Swooping Hawks, which you can pull off the board and put into like Deep Strike essentially, or just standard Deep Strikers. I will say though that deep striking into your opponent's deployment zone against a skilled player, especially a skilled player who knows that this tactical objective exists, could be pretty hard. So I think in most cases, because it's not too hard to screen your own backfield in most games, in most cases, I think that you want to make sure that you have stuff in your list that is just going to be able to straight up move to go fast into your opponent's deployment zone, not rely on deep strikers. Shadow Specters also can move 12 inches, shoot, and then make a free like battle focus action, essentially. Move again, move another 6 inches, I think. That's also really good. But you need something that's quick. Your last tricky option for Fire and Fade, or for behind enemy lines, is the Yinkarn. The Yinkarn can take the place of any unit on the board that is destroyed. This is showing up in a lot of competitive Eldar lists, and so you use your Wraith Cannons on your Wraith Knight to do some mortal wounds to something in your opponent's backfield, or your Fire Prisms. You blow the thing up. You swap it out for the Yinkarn, and then in the charge phase, the Yinkarn charges something and does more damage. If you're doing this with the Yinkarn on turn 1, you're probably going to lose the Yinkarn. But if there is an opportunity to destroy something of equal value and score 5 points, it's definitely worth considering. I personally like to use the Yinkarn as a later game play, but that option is there. Okay, Bring It Down. This secondary mission, if you draw into it as a tactical objective, scores you 1 victory point for 2 victory points for destroying a vehicle or a monster, plus an additional victory point if it has 10 wounds. If it has 15, you get 2 extra. If it has over 20 wounds, you get 3 extra, plus an additional victory point if you're doing tactical missions, and the mission is capped at 8. As an Eldar player, with all of the killy stuff that we have on our lists these days, and the popularity of monsters and vehicles in the game and the current meta, this should be a pretty easy 8 points for you. You need stuff with indirect fire or with towering. So a Wraith Knight with Wraith Cannons, fabulous. some 1D. I'm at 1D cannon on platforms at this point, but a D cannon or two, really good. Fire prisms with that crazy range and the ability to shoot from the position of any other prism that the first prism can see, incredibly powerful. So really good Eldar shooting in particular generally enables you to max this out. I cannot imagine anybody would build a list for tournament play that wouldn't have enough killiness to make the bring it down more or less an afterthought. Okay, attempting target. This one's a little trickier. When the secondary mission card is drawn, your opponent must select an objective marker in no man's land. At the end of your turn, if you control that selected objective marker, the secondary mission is achieved and you score 5 VP. Now, this is one of the harder ones to guarantee that you can do, because often there'll be an objective somewhere on the battlefield that your opponent is just like really stacked on. I will say, and obviously that's the one your opponent chooses, and so this might be one of the cards that you're most likely to end up throwing away for a CP. Obviously, stuff that can charge into melee in the midfield and do serious damage and has good objective control can help you pick this one up. If you're playing with the Avatar of Cain, potentially, but the most powerful tool for scoring a tempting target is the Incarn, because if you can kill literally anything on that objective, you can then go there with the avatar of the Eldar god of death and charge and potentially then wipe whatever is left out with that, or do enough damage that with its what OC it has, it can strip the objective. So it's yet another really good reason to consider having the Incarn in your list. I think the Incarn really is the single best tool for scoring this. And again, hard to reach targets. The Wraith cannons on a Wraith Knight with their 36-inch range and the towering ability, so they can target stuff behind obscuring cover, is really big. And then also the ability to target with indirect fire, so something like a D cannon could be good here too. Capture enemy outpost. You get 8 points if you can get the objective in your opponent's deployment zone. I bet you know what I'm going to say. What's the best tool for this? Clearly the Incarn. You shoot the thing that's squatting on your opponent's home objective. Suddenly the Incarn is there, and then you pick up 8 points. Your other option, of course, if you already have fast units in the midfield, right? So warp spiders. I've mentioned warp spiders already, or shadow specters, or a Viper jet bike. Again, with fire and fade, wow, can you get around? In the mid to late game, if you find yourself largely wiped out, don't forget that you can do this with your fire prisms. All right, no prisoners. Now, I find it fascinating that this is not a fixed secondary, because of course it has been in previous editions. But while this secondary mission is active, each time an enemy unit is destroyed, you score 2 VP to a maximum of 5 victory points. And you score even if the unit is then resurrected. Eldar are really good at killing stuff. You should be able to score at least 4 for this on the turn that you draw it. You don't have to build with this in mind. You're going to have stuff in your list that's good at killing. So this should be a freebie. Secure no man's land. So this one's interesting. If at the end of your turn you control 2 or more objectives in no man's land, the secondary mission is scored and you achieve 5 VP. If you only have 1 in no man's land, you only score 2 victory points. And there's no bonus for it being a tactical objective. So you really do want to hold 2 for this one. Now, this unit, or this mission it encourages you to have fast disposable units. Stuff like War Walkers, Warp Spiders, honestly, even Shadow Specters. They're so cheap right now that if they can float onto an objective, shoot something, or float near an objective, shoot something at relatively close range with their prism rifles, and then use their follow-up move to actually get on the objective, that's worth it, even if you end up losing the unit. I will say that you don't want to have to throw away 2 units for this, probably, because we don't have anything anymore that's like super cheap. So having something like the Avatar of Cain in your list or something that's durable on one of those objectives is one way to do it. Your other option, I really think that any list you put together, you're going to want to have at least one lone operative. And the best lone operative for Craft Worlds players is the Autarch Wayleaper. Now, what lone operative does is it makes it impossible for enemies that are outside of 12 inches of you to target you with a shooting attack. And that's pretty fantastic. So if, for example, you have the Autarch Wayleaper in your list, and I think you should, and it should probably be your Warlord so that you can get an extra CP per battle round, which is huge. That's increasing your CP by 50% per battle round. CP is amazing in this edition. So if you have an Autarch Wayleaper with, say, I don't know, a Starglaive and a fusion gun, that's what mine has, and it pops out of your backfield to finish off something on a midfield objective. Maybe it shoots it with its fusion gun, and then you shoot with other stuff, and you always have the opportunity to charge in there with your Starglaive, and it's a pretty good fighter. And if it's on a part of the battlefield where your opponent just can't get stuff there, potentially, you pick up one objective with your Wayleaper, and you pick up one objective with some other unit that's disposable. You use the shooting attacks, and let me be clear, we're not expecting your Warwalker to kill everything on the objective, but Eldar have really powerful shooting. So you need to start by choosing the units that are going to get onto those objectives, figure out how you're going to do it. Maybe you want to leave one infantry model in your opponent's unit alive so that you can charge on with your Wayleaper if there isn't quite enough movement. Or maybe what you need to do with the Wayleaper is make an advance move and then use matchless agility to guarantee a 6-inch advance. I mean, there are you always have the fire and fade trick, whatever. Like there are tricks available to you, but you figure out how you're going to get onto the objectives, and then you rely on your tremendous Aeldari shooting to pick up the enemy units on the objective. And maybe you have one unit that will die, and another unit that's either very tough or that is a lone operative that won't. And that's a pretty efficient way to score that, to score 5. Okay, Overwhelming Force. This is another freebie, essentially. When this secondary mission is active, each time an enemy unit that started the turn within range of an objective marker is destroyed, you score 3 VP to a maximum of 5. So if you killed one unit, you're going to get 3. If you killed 2, you're going to get 5. You can generally get to 5 on this. And look at it this way. The only reason you might not be able to score this is that your opponent, unless you've been totally devastated and you don't have very much left, but most of the time, the only reason you won't be able to score this is your opponent just doesn't have anything on objectives. And if that's true, like, you're probably already winning. So this is not one you've got to really plan for carefully. Okay, Defend Stronghold. At the end of your opponent's turn or at the end of the battle, whichever comes first, if you control one or more objective markers in your own deployment zone, this secondary mission is achieved and you score 3 VP. And if you draw during the first battle round, you have to discard it. The downside to this one is that it only gets you 3. The upside to it is that it's a free 3 VP unless you're losing the game badly. Generally, if your opponent has control of your deployment zone, in most games as an Eldar player, that's a bad sign. Oh, I will say for you newer players, and the way it's phrased, you choose it and then it's at the end of your opponent's turn or the end of the game. So your opponent has an opportunity, has like a turn to take this away from you. It's on you. It's on your opponent to stop you from scoring generally those 3 points. So for you newer players, make sure you've thought about what you're going to use to screen out your backfield. Screening refers to either having units in front of vulnerable units so that those vulnerable units cannot be charged, so that your opponent's melee units will run into your chaff instead, or it refers to the bubble that units create to keep out deep strikers. So most deep striking units cannot come in within 9 inches of an enemy unit, which means you want to have units positioned around your backfield. If those units are like 17 inches apart, there will be no room for your opponent to bring anything in your backfield. So this generally isn't one you need to plan for, except that if you're a newer player, think about how you're screening out your backfield. A Farseer on your home objective can be good for this. A fire prism 10 inches from the Farseer that's totally out of line of sight, but can see some other fire prism that's fire and fading or just in an advantageous position. D cannons. There are various units that can participate in the battle while also screening out your backfield. You want some of that in your list. Night Spinners, for that matter. Night Spinners have been showing up in a lot of tournament lists that have been doing really well. And one of the advantages to Night Spinners is that they help you screen, and in the late game they can also help you score because they're pretty quick. Okay, Area Denial. This one rewards you for holding the center of the battlefield. If one or more of your units is wholly within 6 inches of the center of the battlefield, and there are no enemy units within 6 inches, and you're not battle shocked, you get 5 VP. If there is an enemy unit there, but you can keep the enemy unit out of 3 inches, then you can score 3 VP instead of 5 VP. This is a good one. Obviously, the Avatar of Cain is good for this. Potentially a big unit of Wraithguard. People are starting to play with the big units of Wraithguard with the Spirit Seer that can resurrect them. It might be a little hard with the size of the base and the sheer number of models. And you don't want them then because they're not super quick. You don't want them tied up necessarily right in the middle of the board. But there are durable units that could be good for this. But you can also rely on stuff that's relatively cheap and disposable. And then, again, rely on your tremendous Aeldari shooting to simply kill what's ever there. And just you mosey in with a Warwalker or a Way Leaper or a single Viper jet bike or something like that. Because Eldar are quick and because Eldar have good killing at range, this is generally not super tough. Again, I'll point out that you can use the Incarn for this. If your opponent has a single unit, more or less in the middle of the battlefield, and you kill it, you could have the Incarn just appear there. So there's another option. Okay, extend battle lines. This one should be a freebie. This is control the objective in your own deployment zone and control one in no man's land. And if you can do that, you get 5. So you never want to lose the one in your own deployment zone, and you're trying to get the ones in the midfield anyway. So this is, again, not one you need to plan for. Unless you're really getting your ass kicked, I think it basically amounts to 5 free victory points. Okay, investigate signals. This one is a bit quirky. So at the end of your shooting, or in your shooting phase, I guess, you select units that are eligible to shoot, and then you don't shoot with them because they're performing actions. They're not. Actions don't technically exist anymore, but they still do. They're just abstracted to this. You don't shoot, and instead you're investigating signals. So every unit that you have wholly within 9 inches of a corner of the battlefield that does this will score you 2 victory points. Now, if you have units in your own backfield that are hanging out, potentially they can do this. So if you have like a Way Leaper that you haven't committed yet, you can move it to one side or the other, like 8 inches from the table edge-ish, and have it do this. And then maybe in the other corner, you do it with, if you have a Night Spinner, you're not going to shoot with it for a turn if you do this. That's kind of a bummer. It would be great if you had something cheap like a Viper or a unit of Rangers. At the far end of the table, the other side of the table, you're going to find it a little bit tougher. Again, this is a reason why people are really digging Warp Spiders right now. Again, you could do it with the Incarn. You kill something in one corner of the table on the other side, or whatever, and you move the Incarn over there. If it didn't shoot, it can do this. It's pretty hard to get to 8 on this unless you are already destroying your opponent. At that point, it's a bit more. But I think it's really easy to get to 4, and you can often get to 6 just because Eldar are so maneuverable. And I think there's going to be some turn potentially, right, where for one of these tacticals, even if it's simply because you drew into the one that only makes it possible to score 3, there are going to be turns when you don't score 5. You don't get the points you really want, right? So you need some. Ideally, you need for there to be a couple of cards where you score more than 5, you get the 8, or you get the 6, and I think this is one of those where you can potentially make that happen. But it's totally fine to just score 4 with it. But it does mean you need to think about a little bit. If this is still in the deck, keep in mind having some stuff on your side of the table that you could potentially move and do this. Because what you don't want to do is score 0 for this. That's a bad whiff. And there are other cards that you would rather. If you're going to throw one away in the course of the game, I think you don't want it to be Investigate Signals. Okay, engage on all fronts. In 8th edition, this was the Eldar Darling. In 9th edition, it was the Eldar, mistress that we didn't really talk about, but occasionally still went to see. It's a little bit tricky. Now, in 10th edition, the way this works is that if you have a unit wholly within all 4 quarters of the board, more than 3 inches from any other quarter, then you score 5 victory points, plus 1. Oh, I'm sorry, it caps at 5. So you score 4 victory points if you have a unit wholly within every quarter, plus 1 if it's a tactical mission. We're assuming it is, so that gets you to 5. And if you've got units in 3 quarters, you score 2, which then goes to 3 as a tactical mission. So it's either going to be 3 or 5. And whether or not you can do it, you definitely already have units in wholly within 2 quarters when you draw into this. I guarantee you. You might have them in 3. You probably have units wholly within 2 quarters, and then some units that are maybe partially into other quarters, but maybe not a full 3 inches. So all this is really calling on you to do is move at least 1 unit somewhere where you might not necessarily have put it. And you're definitely going to have enough stuff that's fast that you'll be able to do this. In order to score 4 with it, you might need to have a unit that is sacrificial. And it is for this reason. I really think you want a handful of units in your list that are fast and cheap and somewhat disposable. Warwalkers, Vipers, MSU Warp Spiders. Again, you can always do it with the Yinkarn, but you certainly don't want to give up the Yinkarn just to score an extra 2 VP. So there's got to be a little more in it for you. Assassination. Yeah, you kill characters. If you can destroy an enemy character, you get 4 VP. Whoa. Or you get 5 VP if it's a tactical mission. And what's cool about this is, even if you already killed all of your opponent's characters, if there are no characters left in your opponent's army, you still get the 5 VP, and everybody has to have characters. So it's always scoreable. It's cool to have something in your army like Illic Nightspear. He's showing up in a fair number of lists. He doesn't always show up with the cadre of Rangers, but he's got that cool. So Illic Nightspear is a special character that doesn't technically have Lone Operative, but he does. He has Hunter Unseen. This model's unit basically has Lone Operative, can't be targeted outside of 12 inches. So if he's alone, he gives it to himself, but he's with a unit of Rangers, he gives it to the Rangers. And then Rangers, of course, have precision. So Illic with his high damage Voidbringer relic sniper rifle that hits on 2s and can target characters, and all of the other Rangers in his unit can do it. A tool like that can be useful for this. Generally, Eldar are so good at killing that if your opponent has a character that you can see out in some sort of unit, there isn't a whole lot in the game that if Eldar can see, they can't kill. Obviously not everything that you can see in your opponent's list, but if you happen to draw into Assassination and there's a unit of Terminators being led by some Space Marine character in Terminator armor, you can probably pick up that unit of Terminators. You might not kill anything else this turn, but that's okay. It's probably good for it to go, and then you score the thing. I would say the only consideration with Assassination is if you know it's in the deck, if you know you haven't drawn into it yet, right? There's 16 of these cards. Over the course of the game, you're going to draw 10 of them. You're probably going to see it. If you have an opportunity to kill an enemy character that you know you could kill at virtually any time, and that character just isn't that big a threat, don't leave it. But wait until you draw into the card. If there's some like minor HQ running around with some relatively harmless enemy unit. Nothing's totally harmless, obviously. You've got to make a judgment call about relative value, but you don't want to create a situation where the one enemy character that's completely out of line of sight that you really can't kill would be the only target for the card, and then you have to throw it away if you can avoid bringing about that situation. Definitely don't let some powerful enemy HQ run roughshod over you in the hopes that you're going to draw into this. But every now and then, it makes sense to make the tactical choice and not kill the thing that you could kill so that you could potentially kill it for points later. Okay, deploy Teleport Homer. One of your units deploys a Teleport Homer, either in the middle of the board or in your opponent's deployment zone. If you can, so it's a 10th edition action, so you're not allowed to shoot or charge, but otherwise you have the unit there. One of the things that I like about this, and is different from last edition, is that if you have a unit with an assault weapon and you make an advanced move with that unit, it's then eligible to shoot. So in previous editions, you could not advance and perform actions, but in 10th edition, you can if there's some way to still be eligible to shoot. And so some unit with an assault weapon, you could potentially use like matchless agility to get an automatic 6-inch advance to get into your opponent's deployment zone, and then pull this off for 5 VP, which is pretty good. Keep in mind, though, that you can't use Fire and Fade for this one for obvious reasons, right? Because the whole thing is you're performing the action, you're not shooting. Warp Spiders, with their insane 24-inch move, can pretty much always do this in the opponent's deployment zone, unless the opponent's deployment zone is so full of the opponent that you just can't get in there. I think you're pretty much always going to be able to do this for 3. Sometimes you're going to be able to do this for 5. Okay, Cleanse. Cleanse is an action that you perform on objectives that are not within your own deployment zone. So you get a unit on the objective, it can't shoot or declare a charge, and at the end of your turn, if you did this on one objective and it's a tactical mission, you score 3. If it's 2 objectives, you score 5. Again, those sort of cheapy disposable units should absolutely be able to do this. And here's the other cool thing. I keep talking about these cheapy disposable units. You can do the following trick, which I really like. So you move on to an objective in the midfield with a Warwalker with its 10-inch move. You cleanse it, and you might be thinking, well, I've got 2 Bright Lances on that Warwalker, and they get one reroll to hit and one reroll to wound, and so it really sucks to then not use that Warwalker in the shooting phase and to probably have it get blown away. Well, Warwalkers are they're pretty tough, so your opponent's going to want to take the Warwalker off the objective. It's kind of resource intensive to do so with the -1 to wound and the 4-up invuln, and you can still shoot with the Warwalker because at the end of your opponent's movement phase, you just drop a CP on Overwatch, and you auto hit with one of those Bright Lances with a free reroll to wound at -4 AP, D6+2 damage, and so you're still. This is a way to perform the action with the Warwalker on the objective, still get to shoot, still get to do damage with it, and then it soaks up a bunch of enemy fire. That's a really efficient way to use that model. Honestly, if you really have to do it, you could even pull that trick with something like a Fire Prism. If it's the late game and you don't have any of your disposable units left, don't forget, there's nothing, it isn't written anywhere that your Fire Prisms have to stay back and not take risks. At some point, it makes sense to move those units into the midfield and start trying to score with them. The game is about victory points at the end of the day, and so you can theoretically move something that you wouldn't normally want to think about not shooting with, and have a trick with Fate Dice to still shoot with it and do your damage. Okay, Storm Hostile Objective. If it's a tactical mission, you get 5 victory points if you take an objective off of your opponent on your turn, or if your opponent just doesn't have any, you score it. Again, this isn't one that you really need to build for. Like every list wants to play the objectives. So if you have a Craft Worlds list that plays the objectives, you'll be able to succeed at this. I will say again, this is a nice one for the Incarn. This can be a little tricky if and only if the only objective your opponent has left is the one in their own deployment zone. That might be a little hard to get to, but like if you can shoot a unit that's on that objective off of that objective and put the Incarn there and have it charge the other thing on the objective and really F it up, then you can score this. So that's what I've got. I think as I went through, it probably became clear to you that it is very reasonable as a Craft Worlds player to assume that you will be able to get to 40 for your secondaries if you're playing tacticals. There are very few situations if you have a good list in which you'll just have to throw a card away. That objective that allows your opponent to choose which objective you have to take. If you do not have the Incarn in your list, I think that is absolutely the card that you might find yourself throwing away. But the way tactical objectives work, you can throw away a card, get a free CP, and still max them out at the end of the game. It's not too nuts. Whereas if you go with fixed objectives, there's absolutely no room for error. Every time your opponent interferes with your ability to do the thing that they know you are trying to do, it costs you at the end of the game. I think as an Eldar player, if you find yourself basically wiping out your enemy on turn 3 or 4, you're going to score 100 points. If it ends up being a really close game, and usually when games are really close as an Eldar player, it's because you and your opponent essentially obliterate one another's armies. And you might not have a lot of tools left in the late game for maxing out your score, unless you really get rocked without doing damage in kind. You should still be able to get into like the 80s, which is a really good tournament score. Eldar are in a really good position right now in competitive play for the simple reason that they're such effective damage dealers that that as a result, they are also very good at scoring. But then they also have these movement shenanigans and tricks with the 24-inch moves and the Phantasming and the Firing and Fading and the Yinkarn that let you shore things up, right? There's a lot of that mobility is important not only for keeping units alive, but also so that you can get to the places that you need to be to do the scoring that you need to do. And in some of the primary missions, the objectives actually move around the field. And so that can be tricky too. So again, the speed really does count for a lot in the game as it currently exists. So there it is. That's what I've got. I'll be back again soon. Probably I'm going to do another, now that the dust is settled with the intro to 10th edition and there's a lot of tournament data and I've played a ton of games. I'll probably do the Our Best Units and How to Use Them update. I've done one of those for every edition so far. If there's particular content you'd like to see, please mention it in the comments below, especially if it's about non-competitive play. I really get a kick out of making other kinds of videos. I tend to gravitate towards the tactical competitive videos in part because they seem to have the largest audience. But if there's other types of content you'd like to see, please don't hesitate to let me know. Again, I really appreciate the likes and the subscribes. I'm really hoping to get to 10K subscribers relatively soon, so it would be awesome if you subscribe if you've not already done so. I have a Patreon, and if you would like to become a patron of the arts, which is a very Aeldari thing to do, you can follow the link in the video description. It's only $3 a month for the basic level. It makes me feel good. You get access to the Discord. You get early access to some videos. You can download a lot of the content as like a podcast format, which is something that some people want. And then there are other levels too, if you're feeling particularly kind. So that's it. Best of luck with your pointy ears. Hope you're enjoying 10th edition. I look forward to being back soon with new content. Take care.